I'm Deacon Eric.
And I'm Dr. Brett Salkeld.
And you're listening to Thinking Faith.
This is a podcast brought to you by the Archdiocese of Regina, where we attempt to navigate this winding road of faith in Jesus Christ so that we might know Him more intimately, love Him more profoundly, and together serve Him more deeply in our daily lives.
Welcome, everyone, to another week of Thinking Faith, and in fact, Rethinking Faith.
Right, yeah, so we're going to continue digging into the back catalog, the over 430 episodes that we had in audio-only format before we moved to YouTube. I know I want to figure out what I'm going to say today.
And now you don't have to.
No.
And we hope you enjoy your helping of Rethinking Faith this week.
I want to welcome you to a new episode of Thinking Faith. Now, last week we ended our discussion about Jesus' suffering and his death and wondering about the necessity of Jesus' death on a cross. We left that with a little bit of a cliffhanger having to do with St. Anselm's approach to this question. Found ourselves wondering if his language, that language coming out of a very foreign, at least foreign to you and me, feudalistic type of culture, I wondered if there might be anything within his approach that could help us better understand this key aspect of our faith today. We're very happy as always to have you join the discussion as we continue delving into Jesus' suffering, redemption, and death on the cross. This week on Thinking Faith.
Anselm approaches this and says Jesus had to die because the problem is such that there is one solution. And the solution he gives is historically conditioned. It uses language that's not familiar to us, that would have been much more familiar to a medieval person who was familiar with the structure of a medieval society where lower people owed certain debts to higher people, and higher people had certain responsibilities to lower people, and honor had a particular way of framing this, right? So there was the lord-vassal relationship, and it's a feudalism, right? Is the social structure in which these categories made some sense. They don't make a ton of sense to us now, and so Anselm needs to be translated. But a lot of what he said actually does make a ton of sense. It's very clear in Anselm, one of the biblical truths that we really want to hold on to, that Anselm had grasped very tightly, is that we are unable to save ourselves. Mm-hmm. That is absolutely biblical. That is what the church has always taught. And his analogy, where Jesus has to come pay a debt on our behalf because we can't pay it ourselves, captures that reality very clearly. We're in a situation where we need help. We can't do this, right? Mm-hmm. If we went into a little more detail, we won't go into a lot, but basically he says God had to become man because man owed the debt and only God could pay the debt. So if the debt was going to be paid, it had to be paid by a God-man because man owed it and God could pay it.
Yeah. And right? He couldn't just pay it out of his own divinity to himself.
Right.
Right.
We had to be caught up in the movement.
Yeah.
And so Jesus comes to us to join himself to us so that we can be joined to him in his offering of this, which is all legit.
Yes.
Right.
And there's truths that echo throughout, even today. Right. That echoing that we touched on in the incarnation.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. There's certain truths within that.
So don't let people sort of badmouth Anselm and sweep him under the rug as if he was all mistaken. The penal substitution that some of Anselm's followers, particularly after the Reformation, took, Catholic theology thinks went way too far and starts distorting things. But Anselm himself, I think, holds up pretty well if you give him a fair reading. Mm-hmm. But the one thing we think he got wrong is he said there was one answer. Mm-hmm. And so the next step historically really is Thomas Aquinas, who more or less agrees with Anselm's articulation. He thinks it works, but he disagrees with Anselm that God had to do it that way. Mm-hmm.
So this is interesting because I wanted to break in here. You shared a little story about a conversation at your dinner table, which gives some great insight into where Aquinas took his jumping off point.
Yeah. So we're sitting around the dinner table, and Oscar, so probably at this stage, Oscar's like 8, right? Mm-hmm. He's the second oldest. He says, why did God use the cross Why did Jesus have to die on the cross to save us if God could have saved us any other way? And Toby, who's 2 years older, says, could he have saved us any other way? Good Socratic method, Toby, right? Yeah. And Oscar says, of course he could. He's God.
Yeah.
I'm just sitting back observing at this point. I'm like, this is great. Let him go. Like, let's see what happens, right? Daisy, who would have been 5, chimes in and says, he could have saved us another way, but he didn't.
Which is where we started from in Scripture.
And I said, Daisy, that is exactly what Thomas Aquinas says.
He didn't, and we've got to work with what
work with what we got, right? So Daisy was dead on, and that's Aquinas says, theoretically, God is God. God could have saved us in any number of ways that we can imagine or beyond what we could imagine. But given that we know from history that this was the way God actually chose to save us, then we can say it must have a certain intelligibility. We should be able to find reasons why this makes sense. Not why it's the only possible way, not why God had to do it. Aquinas doesn't want to put God in that box and say God was forced by circumstance to only respond in this way. That's his problem with Anselm.
Yeah.
But given that God did, there must have been some pretty good reasons for it.
And I like the language that is often used around that, the fittingness.
Right?
Fittingness of the cross.
It was fitting, according to Thomas, it was fitting that God chose to save us this way, and therefore we can explore its fittingness. And so you can read about this in Aquinas, and he's got like long lists of
why.
And some of them some of them are less appealing to a modern reader than others. Some hit us more deeply than others. Some seem a little arbitrary. Right? He lists. I think there's a section in there where he lists how it applies to all our 5 senses.
Oh, yes.
I
remember reading through that,
right,
and thinking, it could be a bit of a stretch to make those connections.
To the modern imagination, that's a bit of a stretch, but that was a very systematic approach.
Yeah.
And I think the deeper truth to it that we can miss if we think that the particulars of this sense or that sense look a little arbitrary is it goes all the way down. It affects every element of mankind. And that's right. That's what
he was trying to get at.
That's, I think, the deeper truth in some of those. But some of the ones that make a little more sense to us are the cross is fitting because it demonstrates for us the depths to which God will go for us. Right? The cross is fitting because it makes clear to us the consequences of sin.
As we were talking before, the wages of sin is death.
Right. So there's a lot of ways in which the cross is fitting because it itself reveals our situation and God's love and God's response to that situation in a very clear and profound way. So there's those kinds of considerations that Thomas will bring forward. But I think the real key for us here is that Thomas's approach has basically then become the approach of the church. We haven't sought one answer that solves this problem the way Anselm thought he had to. Rather, the church has been happy to let preachers, theologians, behave the way the New Testament writers and the fathers did, which is try find metaphors that will make sense to the people. That they can connect their experience and their understanding of life in the world with what God has done for us on the cross. And so, for example, there has never been a conciliar decree on the question of soteriology that defines this is how the cross works, right? We end up with very precise definitions around the incarnation, the hypostatic union, the Trinity, even the Eucharist gets some more precise treatment, but never do we come down in really official ways. And if you read the Catechism as well, you'll see a much more holistic kind of approach to this question. There's no one absolute right Catholic answer to how the cross worked, but rather try this metaphor, try this analogy. Does this make sense of life as you know it, does this give you some sense of God's love? Does this register with your own experience of sinfulness and forgiveness? Right?
An effort to and an openness to making sense of various parts or perspectives without forcing anyone to make a claim on the whole.
Right. Yeah. You never say about the cross, I get it now. I can explain it to everyone in a way that is sort of airtight and makes perfect sense. But what you can say about the cross is, this last Good Friday, I had an experience, whether it was the homily or some dramatization or
an experience of life,
or a reading from Scripture or something that says, oh, that makes sense now in a new way. It doesn't mean there's no more sense to be made. I think part of the Christian life is, like every Lent, we should have a little more
depth, a little more experiential depth to our experience of the cross.
Right.
And that's why I drew in the life experience, right? There are certain events in life, and we've talked about this I'm not sure on the show, but even in conversations, there's certain events in life where you realize this is a Good Friday type life experience. This is a Holy Saturday waiting in the tomb type life experience.
Right.
And in light of living this reality, I now have a clearer understanding of this part of Christ's passion.
Exactly. Right. And we, in a certain way, Lent is kind of an artificial enhancement of that, right?
It's meant to do that.
It's put us in the situation where we're better able to recognize life and death because we practice dying.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Lent is. It's like getting good at dying. You're all going to have to do it.
Yeah.
So you might as well do it well.
Practice.
You're right. You can get good at it. It's the one thing you're guaranteed to have to be able to do is to die. So, practice it.
Yeah.
And so in this Christology course I taught in Saskatoon, which this podcast series grew out of, the way we wrapped the soteriology section was by looking at a couple of modern thinkers who've given us ways of trying to appropriate the meaning of the cross, right? So these are by no means the only modern thinkers on this, but they were ones that I have some familiarity with. And
there are a couple of my favorites. I mean, one was before, and then since the Deacon formation, Girard, which is one of them, has become he does a very good job of opening up aspects of this.
Right. And I think we've mentioned Girard on the show, but I don't know if we've ever given him a whole episode.
No, we haven't.
I wonder if we should.
Oh, yeah, that would be really, really good.
Okay, let's do an episode on Girard.
Yeah.
So we looked at, and the other person we looked at was Bernard Lonergan. And Bernard Lonergan is a Canadian theologian, probably the greatest Canadian theologian.
And philosopher.
Yeah. There's other great Canadian philosophers, but he's certainly, he's up there with all the philosophers, and the only one who would be close to him in terms of Canadian theologian would be Father Girard, who taught in Ottawa for years. But technically he's not Canadian because he's from Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. Okay. So he's technically a Frenchman.
Yes, that's right.
Even though he lived and worked in Canada his whole life.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Lonergan gets an easy pass there. He gets to be the greatest Canadian theologian.
Yeah.
Because the other guy kind of gets disqualified on a technicality. But anyways, so Lonergan is a Thomist. He's following Thomas Aquinas, and he articulates what he calls the law of the cross. And the law of the cross, essentially, in really short scope, says death embraced well leads to new life. And so we read a chapter from a book called The College Student Introduction to Christology, I think, something like that, by William Lowe.
Yes.
And it's got this great chapter on the law of the cross, this Lonerganian look at soteriology. And he tells some like really sort of personal stories to just make it really jump. And the one that hit me the deepest is he tells the story. There's a cop who ends up in like a psychiatrist's office, and he's at a crisis point in his life, and he doesn't know what to do. And so the psychiatrist starts asking him, and he says, "I'm a cop on the take. I'm a dirty cop. I'm getting money from drug dealers or whatever to look the other way and whatever. And it's helping me, give my family a life that I couldn't give them on just my NYPD salary and whatever else. But I got a little boy, and this little boy worships me. He sees Dad. Dad is big and strong. Dad's in the cop's uniform. Dad goes out and fights the bad guys, right? And I look in the mirror, and I can't deal with the fact that on the one hand, I know this little boy worships me and thinks I'm the greatest thing. And on the other hand, I know I'm a cop on the take. And I'm a cop on the take so I can give this little boy
the life that he has.
Right?
And so he's carrying within himself two lives.
Right.
Two selves.
And he's at this heart of this contradiction in himself, right? Which, by the way, the cross is a sign of contradiction.
That's right.
And something has to die.
Yeah. And this is what we were talking about, even as far as where our life experiences can draw us into the cross.
Right. And so he has to get to a point where he can come clean, stop being a cop on the take, live in a more modest way, to be a person of integrity, and to be the man his son actually thinks he is, right? And so he's at this sort of heart-wrenching, broken experience where he has to be able to embrace a kind of death, and out of that death, a new life will come, right?
And here's the thing in the heart of this story, just even as you're telling it, a death is going to happen.
Yeah. There's no option on that.
There's no option. It's going to happen. The question is,
which one? Yeah. I mean, it could be eventually my son grows up and I have to suffer the death of not being the man.
Or I get caught and there's scandal.
Or I could get caught.
Or something goes wrong with the people I'm doing business with.
But death is coming down the pipe.
Yeah.
Right? So you get, and that's all of us, right? Death is coming.
That's right.
But you do get a choice of how to approach it, right? And so, and the more practice you get,
the better you get at it.
Right? So it
doesn't get easier.
Right.
But I wouldn't say easier, but
you get better
at walking into it.
Right. Yeah. And so this is just one modern metaphor, one modern image that helps a modern person think about how the cross works, right? It's not really, it's very practical application. It's not very theoretical about the cross itself. It takes the lesson of the cross and then offers it to us as a practical living out, right? And making sense of our lives. So that was one we looked at. The other one we looked at, we read James Allison's Knowing Jesus, which is a good short introduction to Girard's thoughts. So
René Girard.
So René
passed away just
on my birthday.
On your birthday, yeah. That was last year?
A couple years ago.
Was it a couple years ago?
Yeah, I think it was maybe 2016.
2016, okay.
René Girard, born on Jesus' birthday, died on my birthday.
Brett's claim to fame.
There you go. There's a tenuous connection, but I'm going to take it.
Yeah, take it. You can get it.
Anyways, so René Girard is a major contemporary thinker.
Yeah. It's such an interesting story of how he came to the ideas that he became really famous for developing.
Right.
Yeah, because he started off in literature.
Yeah, he's a literary guy. Yeah. How much time do we have for this? Are we going to do a whole episode on Girard?
We're going to do a whole episode on Girard, yeah.
So we'll save the story a little bit. But René Girard is a student of world mythology and world literature. And he recognizes in it these patterns which he sees of desire and of conflict, and then of the resolution of conflict through scapegoating. That the whole community finds one person or a group, like in Egypt, the Jewish people. I don't know if you've ever been in a society that scapegoats a whole group, but if you look around, you should be able to spot some examples.
And this is the genius of his thinking.
It's just so applicable, right? And he says peace is achieved through the expelling of a victim.
Yeah, the shared expelling.
Expelling. We all get together and throw this guy out, right? And what he finds in the Bible is the same pattern he finds in all of the rest of world mythology, that scapegoats keep getting booted out of the community and killed or exiled or whatever, and peace emerges. Which is, so a lot of the parallel between biblical religion and world mythology and other world religions that people point to, he says, yeah, it's there. They're like, because humans are humans and they behave the way humans behave. Mm-hmm. But then he says, actually, the Bible is unique in world literature because even though it tells the same story that everyone else is telling, it tells it from a different point of view. It tells it from the point of view of the victim. Mm-hmm. And so, let's imagine, for example, what we had instead of the New Testament was Pilate writing the story of this guy he had to crucify the other day, right? Yeah. If we had Pilate's journal, Pilate would not tell the story as, here was an innocent victim who was unjustly accused and unjustly put to death and whatever else. Pilate would tell the story that would make it sound like this action, which we all know to be unjust because we've heard the gospel, he would present it as a just action, mm-hmm. and a justifiable
and a
action.
Reasoned action.
And a reasoned action,
yeah.
Right? And Girard says that's what we all do. Mm-hmm. Like we make excuses. We justify our scapegoating tactics, mm-hmm. The reasons we expel people and whatever. And he says that's what world mythology largely is this pattern of covering up the innocence of the victim. And what the gospel, first of all, even before the gospel, what the Old Testament starts and what the gospel sort of brings to completion is the recognition that the victim is innocent, mm-hmm. and that Cain is guilty and Abel is innocent. So Cain and Abel, in a lot of ways, is the same story as Romulus and Remus at the founding of Rome. But in Rome, the murder of the brother is justified, mm-hmm. and the murderer gets a city named for him.
Yeah, and begins the nation of Rome, right? The Empire of Rome.
And so many foundation mythologies of cities or countries or peoples are based on these murders, actually, if you start looking around, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but Cain, by the way, also builds a city, just like Romulus.
Yeah.
But instead, it's considered a terrible thing. Mm-hmm. Anyways, this basic framework has really given contemporary theologians a really interesting tool for explaining what's going on the cross. That on the cross is this human pattern that we all do all the time. We do it in our families. We do it in our workplaces. We do it in our political environments. We do it on our sports teams. Yeah.
We pick a victim.
We constantly.
And we sacrifice them for the benefit of ourselves, to further ourselves, right. Or further our group and agendas.
It's a great tool for understanding playground bullying, mm-hmm. in fact. Right? Like that is like maybe the simplest, most obvious place to see a group expelling an individual. And the innocent bystander, or the quasi-innocent bystander who doesn't really approve of the bullying, but doesn't step in and say anything, because he knows that would turn him into the scapegoat too. So he wants to be identified, even though he doesn't agree with what the group is doing. For his own safety and social standing, he wants the group at least to identify him with the group and not with the victim, which is how everyone gets co-opted into these kinds mm-hmm. of patterns of behavior, even when lots of us think they're wrong.
And you see this play out in the gospel stories as the disciples themselves, when it comes down to it.
Peter.
Yeah, Peter is the classic example of that. And yet, on the flip side of it, in just a few days, all of a sudden they're scrambling to be identified with the victim.
Right. And the resurrection
this is the turning point, right?
Right.
This is how Christianity and the cross and resurrection turns it on, that whole scapegoating system on its head.
Right.
One, the victim doesn't stay buried and disappeared.
This is a problem.
Yeah.
If you when you scapegoat people, when you kill them, they need to stay dead.
They need to be gone, right? In the Old Testament, the scapegoat gets put out into the desert and disappears.
Right.
With everyone's sins, right? With the cross, the victim rises from the dead and won't stay buried.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the fascinating things, we looked at this story in diaconate formation. Mm-hmm. There's a story in, is it in Joshua? The story of Achan.
Oh yeah,
who gets gets stoned to death.
Yeah,
and he the stones get heaped up on him after you stone someone to death. You keep throwing rocks until you can't even see the body. Right. Yeah. So stoning is simultaneously murder and burial. Mm-hmm. And what it needs to do is it needs to hide from the community the innocence of the victim. Mm-hmm. And what do you do on a pile of rocks with a victim underneath it? You offer sacrifice. Like you actually set up, and the Old Testament says it explicitly, that you set up altars on top of these altars of undressed stone. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? It means a pile of rocks.
Just a pile of rocks,
right?
Yeah.
And what does Jesus do but roll away the stone?
Yeah.
Right. The stone is what keeps the victim's innocence hidden, and with Jesus you can't do that, right?
Mm-hmm. Which is what confounds people in the days, weeks, months, years, centuries afterwards.
Right.
Is that this Jesus just won't go away.
Right.
We thought we solved the problem.
Right.
Thought we could all move on. And yet here he comes.
Right.
What do the disciples say? What does Peter and the others say when they're hauled into court and told, we're going to let you go, but you just need to shut your mouths?
Right.
They say, we can't. How are we going to keep quiet? And they just start marching around. Right. Literally right out of the court.
And they tell them they're going to do it. Yeah. Sorry, we're actually just going to go.
Yeah, we got an appointment right now. Speaking engagement on the steps, actually.
So this, anyways, this framework that Girard gives us, many contemporary people have found so helpful for thinking about how the cross makes sense of culture, politics, interpersonal struggle, all kinds of things in our lives that the cross can shed light on, right? Mm-hmm. So we'll do another episode on Girard, but that's a very contemporary soteriology that is right in line with the church's insight that what we need is every age is going to need to figure out how to talk about the cross in ways that are going to make sense to the Christian people and to the non-Christian people.
Yeah.
I mean, Girard is a very great tool for apologetics, right?
Because we're all experiencing these things.
Right, yeah. Right. It really, and it relates it to culture and politics and world mythology and other world religions in ways that are really clarifying, right? Mm-hmm. So this is what Paul was doing. This is what Jesus was doing. This is what Anselm was doing. They were taking metaphors and ideas that were coherent, understandable to their audience in their cultural milieu. Mm-hmm. And there are certain things of sort of permanent value in that we get, that we're responsible to, but they don't exhaust the whole thing, right? Mm-hmm. That understanding the cross is something that every generation of Christians is going to have to put in dialogue with their own experience of life, of culture, all those kinds of things, and come up with metaphors. And we'll find metaphors in our past too that are very helpful. Mm-hmm. But sometimes we'll find ones that aren't as helpful anymore because of the we're not medieval peasants. Mm-hmm. Feudalism isn't our category. And then, it takes a little careful handling to not just throw Anselm under the bus. Mm-hmm. But we're still doing it today, right? Lonergan, Girard, and others. And
even people at home who are trying to make sense of those sacrificial living and dying moments in their lives. They're doing this work on the fly.
You got it.
Yeah.
And preachers.
Yeah.
And I mean, a preacher's job is to make this real in somebody's life so that they can make those connections, right? Mm-hmm. So preachers should be reading people like Girard and Lonergan and trying to find ways to communicate this.
And speak into that. Great. Well, another great topic, another great show, and we're really, really glad to have people joining us again. And we want to thank you for doing that. Now you've got some intake stuff going on for deacons.
Oh, yes.
Coming up. And so we want to give a plug for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've had some people calling you?
I've had some contacts from interested people who wonder if they might be called to the diaconate, permanent diaconate.
Okay.
So I like being employed. So,
and we like deacons.
Also that.
I'm kind of fond of deacons.
I'm not completely self-centered. I also like deacons.
There we go.
I'm super excited. I'm hearing stories now about some of the guys who were ordained in June.
Yeah.
Different ministry opportunities that have sort of emerged in their lives since the ordination. Oh, exciting stuff.
Very cool stuff.
So
this is for an intake starting fall of 2019.
So the program would start of fall of 2019, but the intake is basically like, you can call me now.
Yeah.
And get started on the process. We're going to be working, sort of October, November, December, January to work through the discernment process.
Phase.
Yeah.
So people want to get in touch with you, they can look you up through the website.
Yeah, they can email me.
Email you.
BRETZKY @hotmail.com.
Okay.
Or phone me 352-1651 extension 214.
Wonderful. And we want to thank you for joining us this week on Thinking Faith. As always, we pray that God may continue to bless you and those you love with a faith that is always seeking understanding.
Amen.
Amen.